Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to World of Tanks. And I'm just going to be talking a bit about the French tanks that we see in World of Tanks Blitz, and we're actually here on the redesigned Fort Despair map, which is interesting, to say the least. So, yeah, once we get into the game here. There we go. So, I'm actually driving the Hotchkiss 38H, and so lots of people will probably be wondering exactly why there are French tanks in the German army tech tree, namely the biggest one being the Panzer S-35, and that's because anybody with some historical knowledge of World War II will know that France fell very, very quickly, leading in the leading stages of the war, because of the German assault which occurred. Through Belgium, bypassing the defensive Maginot Line of the French, and because of this, they were able to get through Belgium, away from France, or bypassing the defensive Maginot Line. And what the Maginot Line was a series of heavy concrete defences which were designed to stop any sort of German assault on France, because of course France had already fought the Germans in World War I, and so they were pretty anxious not to let the Germans come and attack them again. And so the design was to have big anti-tank guns and artillery and defensive emplacements for troops all along the border of France with Germany. And so they created the Maginot Line. And indeed it would have been impenetrable to the Germans. However, they'd forgotten a little country which was known as Belgium, which was just sort of on the outskirts of France. And the Germans had obviously had some success prior to World War II, where they actually went through Belgium in the first place. And so, yeah, that sort of bypassed their whole Maginot Line thing, which was otherwise a very good idea. And so, because of the fact that the Germans were able to go through Belgium, they bypassed the whole Maginot Line, and it meant that the German Blitzkrieg was very effective on France, because they didn't have to go through the Maginot Line, which meant that they didn't need any sort of heavy armour or heavy assault guns to actually the Maginot Line get in amongst the rear lines of the French, and sort of cause havoc. Even with the British there, the French still didn't have much luck there. And so the French did have the best tanks of the era, even though you might not have guessed it from the swiftness of the German assault through France. However, the German, if you actually compare the tanks side by side, which the Germans and the French had at the time, it's pretty easy to see which would have won in a forward engagement, because you take the early models of the German tanks which would have assaulted through France. You've got the Panzer I, which had at most a pair of 7.62mm machine guns, and they would have pinged right off the heavy armour of the French tanks. Then you've got the Panzer IIs, which you've got 2cm autocannons or flak guns, and flak guns are good for tearing through infantry, light fortifications, light vehicles such as half-tracks, Bren gun carriers, armoured cars, trucks, the like. However, against the heavy armour of the French tanks, they had very, very little success. And if we can actually get into this battle, you might be able to see the Panzer S-35. There you go. There we go. And I have no idea why I set off so late to the party. But, there we go. So, The German Panzer II didn't have much on any of the French things that were about, and so what else did the Germans have? Well, they had Panzer IIIs, and Panzer IIIs were a pretty good match against the French tanks. The Panzer IIIs, which had the longer barreled guns, such as the high velocity 37mm guns, or even the later ones which had... Oh god, why am I lagging? What is this terrible, terrible lag? Or even, sorry, I'm getting sidetracked by terrible lag. But even the later model Panzer IIIs, such as the Panzer III Alpha J, which had the... well, at least I think it was the Alpha J model, which had the 50mm anti-tank gun. Those were able to punch through the German armour, or the French armour. God, what is this horrific lag? Like, this is just horrible stuttering. But yeah, so only really the later model Panzer IIIJs with the 50mm dedicated anti-tank guns mounted in them would have been the only things that would have really been able to take out French tanks. Perhaps even the early model Panzer IVs would also have had fairly difficult, a fairly difficult time actually getting through the thick 40mm or so armour of the French tanks, because the short-barreled 75mm that we see on the early models, Alpha A's to Alpha D's, even to the Alpha F1s, those were all more sort of howitzers, because they're being used more as infantry support tanks, and I actually managed to do a fair amount that game, even though I was lagging horribly. But anyway, yes, I don't know why. Why am I lagging so horribly? Yay, more credits, as if I need more. Okay, but yeah, I have no idea why the lag is occurring. Let's try a different battle, shall we? But anyway, so yes, the up to the F1, the Panzer IVs had the short-barreled 75mm on them, which were more howitzers than anything else, which meant lots of high explosive. The penetration power of armor piercing would not have been that good, and at anything further than close range, really, the short-barrel 75s would have been fairly ineffective against the French armor. And so that meant that the only things that the Germans could really do against the French armour would have been the flak 88mm anti-aircraft guns, which we all know were evolving, or were adapted at least, into the later model German tanks, such as the Tiger and Tiger II, and the Ferdinand, and varying other, big anti-tank guns, or big, heavy tanks of the late war German panzers. The 88s were really the only things that the Germans had against the French armour at the beginning of the war, and because of that, as you can see, my Panzer V2 is doing very well against any of these tanks, and I can now shoot this Panzer with impunity. And so, I'll take this headset. Dead. But yeah, because the 88s were really the only thing reliable to take out French tanks, that meant that the Germans actually had a rather difficult time taking out any sort of French tanks. And if you look at the French tanks compared to the German tanks at the time, it's not difficult to see why. The French tanks had all of that armour mounted on them. They were fairly slow, as you can see from the S-35, the Hotchkiss, the D1s, the Char B1 bis, and all of those Char C2s, they were all sort of fairly slow tanks, but that's because they were more infantry tanks, such as the Matildas, the Churchills, designed to be used as sort of roving squadrons of more sort of cavalry, or well, maybe not cavalry, but they were designed to sort of be mixed in with infantry, which was really not the best idea. But they had loads of armour on them. 40mm was not uncommon on the French tanks, as we can see in World of Tanks. Their 47mm guns, albeit, even though they weren't the biggest gun being fielded at the early stages of the war on tanks, for example, you got the short barrel 75s on the early Panzer IVs, but even so, the 47mm gun was an anti-tank gun, or at least capable of being an anti-tank gun to the early model, to the early war German tanks. And as you can see, I can pierce right through this BT2, no problem. And there we go. And that meant that... There we go, I can circle strafe this Panzer S35. But that meant that any French tanks that the German panzers came up against, they would have had a rather hard time destroying on their own. And that was a big problem if the French actually put up more of a fight. And I'm lagging again, I don't know why. It's like anything to do with the S35. And I lag. Why? Does my game not like tier 3 games? Help. God, this is like almost undrivable. But yeah, so he's dead. So the French tanks were going to give them a bit of a problem. However, were it not for the Blitzkrieg, which is literally lightning war, the French tanks would have been more of a problem than they otherwise were. And so, hey, yeah, oh no. And so the Germans really had to put all of their money banking on the fact that they would reach Paris before suffering too many losses at the hands of the French tanks. And because of the Blitzkrieg doctrine, they did reach Paris in a good time. There we go. God, I can't even auto-aim on this guy because it's lagging so much. Anytime. Come on. God. This lag is horrific. This guy would be dead if I hadn't lagged so much. There we go. But anyway, yeah. So the Germans reached Paris, and the British forces were being pushed back, which were assisting France, and they were being pushed back, and therefore the French tanks were being captured as the French were surrendering across the line. And so, hey, he's finally dead. And so that meant that the German army was able to take, or commandeer as it were, they were able to commandeer a lot of these French tanks. And since they were considerably better than anything which they had up until that point, they decided to, of course they can't keep them with the French names because, you know, well, I mean, who would do that? So they can't do that. And so what they did is they renamed them. They didn't completely rename them. Yay. They didn't completely rename them because if we have a look at the long name, as you can see, they've renamed it the Panzerkampfwagen S35 739F. And in and of itself, they've obviously named it Panzerkampfwagen, which is the standard thing. It's like armored like tank wagon or something. S35, which is the original name. 739, which is, I can't quite remember, but it's some designation that they gave it, and then in brackets the F shows that it stands for France. If it was something like a Matilda, for example, because they did capture a fair amount of Matildas as well, if it was a Matilda, then it would be Panzerkampfwagen, Matilda, blah blah blah, E in brackets, and the E would show that it would stand for England. If it was a T-34, it would be the Panzerkampfwagen T-34 bracket R for Russia, and so on and so on. So of course all the French tanks have got the bracket F at the end of it. And so they basically pushed the French tanks into service that they got as they were pushing the British and French back towards Dunkirk. And so they first up renamed them, then they gave them the new look of paint, obviously, and then they probably would have had some of them on the front line. But after the British and the French escaped at Dunkirk, and the French surrendered because they don't want the Eiffel Tower to get damaged by the war, after they surrendered, the Germans obviously captured all of the French resources. They even captured some Renault FTs from the First World War. Relics, really, of the First World War at this point. But they did capture some Renault FTs. And so they would have renamed them. And basically, they just sort of used the French tanks as rearguards or on secondary fronts. For example, the Norwegian front probably would have been a place where they would have put these French tanks in. Another secondary front, which they might have also put it in, would have been, before Operation Barbarossa, they would have had it in possibly the Russian front. Not that it was really a Russian front at that point, but they would have possibly had them in there. After that, they sort of just left the French tanks to their own devices with their German crews. And yeah, basically the whole reason that they got any of these French tanks is because of the fall of France and how quickly they actually pushed through. And let's actually aim on the lower glacis of this panzer, and we bounced. As you can see, the B1 would have been the biggest threat from the French to the German panzers, because not only has it got this 47mm up here in this turret, it's also got the 75 in the hull, and the 75 is decent enough at taking out tanks, but also at taking out fortifications, also for taking out infantry, because it is after all a howitzer. And because of the lag, this thing is going everywhere. And honestly, I have no idea what is causing lag. There we go. As you can see, there's a short-barreled Panzer IVA. That would have been something which would have gone up against the B1. And the S-35s. God, this lag. Where is it coming from? But, yeah. Basically, the whole reason that French tanks are in the German tech tree, a lot of tanks, and the whole reason that the Germans have actually got French tanks, is because they liked nicking people's tanks and reusing them, pretty much. The Germans would capture T-34s, they would take T-34s, KV-2s, KV-1s, cruiser tanks. Also, they would take Matildas, the early model Matildas, as well. Obviously, all the French tanks from the ending of the Battle of France. All of the British equipment which they took from Dunkirk, they used a fair amount of universal carriers as just sort of like ferrying things around. Obviously, as the general troop carriers, they used universal carriers. They also used half-tracks from D-Day and the recapture of France. They would use captured American M3 half-tracks occasionally. And yeah, the Germans just sort of generally reused everyone else's assets. Like a bad video game developer, they would just nick other people's assets and just go, yeah, we did this, just repaint it, slap a cross on it, give it a German crew, and yeah, this is our tank now. But yeah, as you can see, this is an actual French tank, the B1. This is the actual French tank in the French army. The one we get is slightly modified, as you can see. The cupola is different, it's less rounded. The Germans on this specimen have got rid of the howitzer in the hull, and they've just sort of replaced it with just a simple cover. But yeah, there really was actually very little reason for the Germans not to use French tanks when they took them, because they were better than the Panzer IIs and the Panzer Is which they had. Better than that Covenanter who's just been killed off by the Lynx over there, because the Lutch means Lynx, Hetzer means Beta, Wesp means Bumblebee, which is rather funny considering the fact that it's a big self-propelled gun. But yeah, this Hetzer obviously either has a damaged engine or the stock engine, and he's not going to last for much longer once that Lynx gets around him. He's a derp Hetzer, the Lynx is going to flank him. He's attempting to as he rushes past my B1. Come on, Hetzer. Yes, good shot from the Hetzer. But now the Lynx is going to take it. Although he can't. He could have gone around, but then he doesn't really know the Hetzer's reload. Depends if this Hetzer's using HE or not. But yeah. So yeah, the whole reason that the French tanks are in the game, in their German variants, is because of the fall of France, the surrender of the French and the British at Dunkirk. Basically the Germans nicking all of their tanks and saying, thanks for that, we're taking them now. And yeah, just because they were sort of objectively better than the base versions of the German tanks. Obviously, the variants of the Panzer II, namely being the Marders, were the more useful versions of the Panzer IIs, which could therefore withstand the French tanks. Even to a degree, the Panzerjäger 1 on the Panzer I chassis with its 47mm gun, which it had. Well, okay. Victory, I guess. Well, it's a draw. Yeah, draw, battle time expired. Oh, I didn't do very well, I was lagging, but I think that's enough. That's enough of that. So, yeah. Yeah. It's just because the French tanks were better than the German tanks at that point. It will come as a surprise to a lot of people when, if you ask them about the Blitzkrieg and you say, were the Germans better than the French, or more specifically, were the German tanks better than the French tanks at the beginning of the war, a lot of people will probably say yes, because they're not encountering the fact that it was the tactic that was more successful than the tanks. The reason that the Germans won the Battle of France was probably not because of their Panzer Corps as of such. It wasn't because of the tanks themselves, it was how they used them. It was just a sort of constant push through France with very little stops. It was just a sort of constant boom, 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 wear them down. And it will probably surprise a lot of people when you say, actually, no, the French tanks were far superior than the German tanks at that time because of the technology that the French implemented, or not so much the technology, but because of the design. The designs themselves may not be... They may look very odd, but the designs worked. They had the thickness of the armor, they had the the wellness of the gun. All they lacked really was the crew sort of discipline, as it were. They sort of more lacked the crew discipline and the crew training, because the French obviously didn't. Because the French didn't have the experience of using tanks in warfare other than World War One, really, because World War One was the last major combat that the French saw before World War Two. That meant they designed these tanks, but they didn't really have anywhere to test them. Whereas a couple of years prior to the outbreak of war, you had the Spanish Civil War, and during the Spanish Civil War, the Germans went in to support the pro-fascist government. Or I think it was actually the pro-fascist rebels. I don't know. They went in to support the fascist side of the Spanish Civil War, where they therefore got the chance to test out all of their newfangled technology. For example, the Messerschmitt 109 was first used in the Spanish Civil War, and the Luftwaffe pilots gained valuable battle training, and they were able to form tactics. Prior to the Battle of France, the Luftwaffe pilots were also able to sort of test out their machines. The scientists could therefore work on new things. The Panzer Corps, the early model Panzer IVs, I think, were sent into the Spanish. The early model Panzer IVs were sent into Poland, where they did very well. But the Panzer Is and Panzer IIs were sent in they were sent into the Spanish Civil War, and it was there that they learnt the major weaknesses of the Panzer I, which was the thinness of the armour, and the fact that anti-tank guns were just able to sort of tear through Panzer I armour, because it's literally so thin. It's literally just about bulletproof. And the Panzer II also had some weaknesses which they were able to sort of straighten out. And it wasn't quite as weak as the Panzer I, but they realised that they needed something better, which is where the Panzer III was developed. And so the German crews got valuable experience in their early panzers, and it allowed them to form the Blitzkrieg doctrine more effectively and to gain valuable battle tactics, which the French just didn't have at the beginning of the Battle of France. So they were undertrained. They had good equipment, but they didn't know how to use it, and that was probably the major downside of the Battle of France, which is that the French, if they'd been more organised, if they had the better tactics, if they had battle experience sort of against the Germans, or perhaps against even tanks, just any tanks, they probably would have been able to hold much better than they otherwise did against the Blitzkrieg. But because they didn't have the training of the Germans from the Spanish Civil War, they just sort of weren't able to, which allowed the Germans to sort of push through and rush to Paris, bypass the Maginot Line, because the French were really sort of banking on the Maginot Line to be their sort of defense against the Germans. But as it happens, it sort of didn't work out for them. And so, yeah, let's just do that. There you go. So, yeah, that's why the French tanks are in the game in the German tech tree, because of the Battle of France and the Germans nicking things all the time during the war. So, thank you for watching, and goodbye.